I just wanted to, there we go. Um, I just wanted to kind of review, like, was sort of interesting. I was looking back through the files. So we had our first kickoff meeting back in November of 2021. So this project has been underway for quite a while. And then from there, we created the digital library. And over the summer of 2022, I was doing a lot of lake-wise visits, actually 16 properties, plus a few more from the year before, and I've actually done a few this year. So that's been really exciting, and it was really a great opportunity to get to know a bunch of people and see the lake from many of your beautiful properties. And while I was doing that, Mary was busy assessing the hydrologically connected roads and some of the tributaries, and she's going to talk a little bit more about that, although you've heard about it along the way. We did do the update in February of this year, and there'll be a lot of overlap, but it's interesting to sort of see it all pulled together. And I think everybody got the reminder that the final report is available on the Lake Fairlee Association website. You should have received a link to that by now, and we'll also put the recording there. So if anybody didn't get a chance to read that cover to cover, I'll be really disappointed, but I'll give you some time there. And we'll also be putting together a press release to sort of let the larger community know that this report is available if anybody wants to look at it. And I think also I would be interested, if the Lake Fairlee Association is doing a meeting, if you want me to just do a little blurb, or you guys want to do a little blurb that just sort of tells people that it's there. I think, it's important that we keep this effort moving forward and going along. So without talking too much longer, I will turn this over to Mary and let her kind of give us the final report. And I hope everybody can see her, see the beginning of her PowerPoint here.
Yep, we can see it.
Oh, good. Okay. Great. So I will turn it over to Mary.
Thank you, Lisa. I will try not to be long so we can all get out and enjoy the beautiful day. But I'm excited to be here to talk about the final Lake Watershed Action Plan for Lake Fairlee. Some of these slides will be a repeat of February. I apologize for that, but we'll just kind of go through them. I think some of you were already on the call. So for the Lake Watershed Action Plan, our primary goal was to identify sources of sediment and phosphorus that were entering Lake Fairlee. And we looked at 3 different areas. We looked at streams as sources of phosphorus. We looked at the shoreland as sources, and the roadways that are connected or flow to streams. Another thing we did is we looked at land cover, and we just moving something out of the way here. We looked at the percentage. We used the land cover data from UVM to try to compare that, what Lake Fairlee has for land cover, to some of the other lakes that have watershed action plans that had numbers for them. So in the left side, you can see that some of the other lakes, their watershed in square miles, their lake area in acres. And then we looked at the percentage of tree canopy, the percentage of grass and shrubs, and the impervious area. And using this 2016 land cover data and doing some work in GIS, we found that 67% of the buffer, the 250-foot buffer around Lake Fairlee, has tree canopy. So that was a pretty good finding. It's kind of at the higher and mid to higher end of the range compared to some of these other lakes in Vermont that have published data. And in terms of impervious cover, it had 11%. So once again, that's kind of at the lower or mid to lower end of the range of these, what are they, 6 or 7 lakes. And this is what the analysis looked like, the mapping analysis that I did. So you can see the green is where there's a lot of tree canopy. And if you know Lake Fairlee fairly well, that makes sense that this side of the lake, kind of the southern side, has more tree canopy. And then you can see where some of the wetlands are along, this is Middlebrook, and there's some wetlands kind of at the mouth of Blood Brook that are really important in terms of habitat and sediment and phosphorus reduction. So it's really important to keep those wetlands intact. And this is a new map. This is in the report. This was kind of a fun mapping exercise. I enjoy this. So the little circles are all the buildings in the Lake Fairlee watershed. And so you can see that they're really concentrated on the western side of the lake. And I did this analysis that showed the density of buildings, or basically the number of units of buildings per square mile. So the darker orange shows the areas where it has the densest building density. And so that's not surprising probably to you if you live along the lake. You can see these orange areas where there's a higher density of buildings. And I think there were 575, something like that, buildings in the watershed. Oops, let me go back. And then the other interesting thing was that there's quite a concentration of buildings along some of these streams, along Blood Brook. Of course, there's Blood Brook Road that goes up there, and Middlebrook and Middlebrook Road. So you can see that away from the lake, that a lot of the density of structures is right along those 2 main inlet streams to Lake Fairlee. I looked at some of the water chemistry data, and I think it's really important moving forward that the water chemistry monitoring program continues. It's a great tool for understanding what sort of inputs there are into the lake in terms of phosphorus. And there was a special tributary study done in 2020, and it would be great if some additional monitoring could be done in the future for those tributaries. But the tributary that had the highest concentrations was Norway Creek. And I understand from Danielle, who was the former watershed coordinator, that this was all done under base flow conditions. And so Norway Creek is down here at the southern end of the lake. And then there's been monitoring of the 2 main inlet streams to Lake Fairlee in both 2021 and 2022. And I won't talk too much about this, but this is some information that I got from Mark Mitchell in terms of these circled areas are times that sampling occurred during precipitation events, rain events, or freshet events. And you can see, especially on Blood Brook, that there's some elevated concentrations during rain events. So the green triangles are the lower end of Blood Brook near the mouth at King Hill Road. And you kind of can see these are some of the events. This is the lower end. You can see some spikes even during low flow events on Middlebrook down at the Route 244 crossing, or at the lower end of the brook. So it definitely looks like there's some phosphorus inputs from these main inlet streams. The other thing that's noteworthy is I have a line going across at 15 micrograms per liter. And that's the state water quality standard for medium high gradient streams. So you can see that there are times that these inlet streams are exceeding the state water quality standard.
Mary, not to interrupt, just a clarification on that. I actually did the water testing for those tributaries in 2021. And just to add a little color to the circled flows on Blood Brook and Middlebrook, while the concentrations of phosphorus ended up being on the high end for those 2 sampling dates, I will tell you that even though it was supposed to be a freshet event, the flows during those sampling periods, especially towards the end of the summer, were barely a trickle. In fact, in Blood Brook, the water flowing underneath the bridge where we did the sampling was only about 3 or 4 feet wide and about maybe an inch or 2 deep. And it was barely enough water flowing through there to make too much of an influence or impact on what was flowing into the lake. So the flow is actually very, very low.
Very low.
While those concentrations might have been high. So
yeah, it might be worth it to do some spring sampling or sample at times of the year when the flows are higher.
Well, we're doing that now. In fact, we've been sampling for the last I think we're on our 4th week now for this year. So we started at the end of May. So
yeah, sometimes you can get very different results under, at different times of the year when you have snow melt and higher runoff.
yep.
Thank you.
And you can see that in the earlier dates in 2021 when we sampled there, those numbers are pretty low. So, and the flow was much higher in those earlier dates. So.
And then I also had this, this was from Mark Mitchell as well. These dates he was saying were freshet events. So that's the other thing. I mean, we don't really have a good handle on the flow conditions, and maybe at some point that's something worth visiting or trying to get a better handle on what the stream flow conditions are at the during the water quality sampling. And then you've all heard about the Lake Fairlee scorecard. This information was pulled from the DEC website, and I'm just presenting it here. I wasn't the one that scored it, so but it says that the watershed is moderately disturbed and the water quality standards are stressed, and it indicates that there's a poor water quality trend. So I won't spend a lot of time on that because you've probably heard about that at other presentations. So the first sector that we looked at is roads, and I'll tell you a little bit about how we assess the roads. We reviewed the municipal road erosion survey or inventory data, and you can see that on the graph here. So the green lines are roads that are meeting the standards. The yellow ones are partially meeting. Some of these weren't completed. It just looks at the roads that are hydrologically connected. And then there were just a couple places. There was one on Quinnipiac Road, a little segment that didn't meet the standards. And I did notice when I was out there doing my road erosion survey that there had been some work done in that area. So maybe the town was already out addressing some of those issues. It is a snapshot of what's going on at a particular time. So I walked the roads within 1 mile of Lake Fairlee and gathered information about where there were sources of sediment coming in, or could be sources of phosphorus. And then, of course, with the lakeshore assessment, there was some work that was done in the office, mapping using geographic information systems to try to understand what land cover was like and where there was the most developed portion of the watershed. In June 2022, we went on a wonderful boat tour around the lake, and that was really helpful for just understanding the layout of the lake and what it really looked like on the ground. So we appreciate the effort that the Lake Fairlee Association made and community members to give us a boat tour. And then Lisa, as she talked about, and I can show you a map of this in a minute, she conducted quite a few lake-wise assessments. And after she did that, she set up some visits and we met with some of the landowners about potential projects on the lake. And so this is a map of the 18 lake-wise associations. The green dots are places where she did her lake-wise visit, and 11 of those properties have been awarded the lake-wise designation. And I think Lisa told me it was like 37% of the lake shore had been evaluated. So that's a good chunk of the lake already to look at. And if you're talking to your neighbors and you can convince them to do some plantings along the lake shore, or if they have questions and would like to do a lake-wise evaluation, we have Lisa's contact information at the end of the presentation. The second area is streams to look at phosphorus and sediment inputs. And so I spent some time compiling the water quality data that was available and looking at that. And then I also went back, and Bear Creek had done a stream geomorphic assessment report in 2011 from some field work we did in 2010 in the Pompanousek watershed. And Blood Brook and Middlebrook were part of that stream geomorphic assessment. So we had already walked those streams and identified projects at that point. So I went back to look to see where those projects were, and it's kind of interesting. I think I mentioned this the last time, you know, a decade later, I'm still identifying the same projects. So sometimes it can be a little bit of a challenge, but it was good to get out and look at the brooks again. And there were some nice, really nice wetlands along both Blood Brook and Middlebrook. And so we walked about 6 river miles, which walking through wetlands and shrubs and stuff can be a challenge. So we looked and we mapped where there was sediment input coming in. And I'm just showing you, there are 12 inlet streams to Lake Fairlee, and Middlebrook makes up about 52% of the watershed contribution, whereas Blood Brook is about 20%. And so these other streams, you know, just are a small percentage of the watershed. And then in terms of the road projects, I'm now on to the results. We identified some road projects on Robinson Hill Road. And when I was out there during the spring 2022, there was a pretty bad mud season that year. And you could see where sediment could get to the lake. Robinson Hill Road is in pretty close proximity to the lake. So we're proposing a paving project and a cross culvert to improve the drainage in that area, and also potentially doing some work on the pond outlet to control debris. And there were a number of lake-wise assessments done on Anna Dodge Road. And so we also looked at that road in terms of sources of sediment and came up with a project. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on in the report and share with you the conceptual design we did for that project. And then on Quinnipiac Road, it's probably a pretty simple project, just poking some holes in the berm or sediment that had built up along the road. And then on Bragg Road, on a really steep section, putting in a cross culvert or a turnout to reduce erosion and sediment, where the water was going directly off the road, the water and sediment, and getting into a nearby stream. And so here are our projects. And I showed this the last time. This was a project we had identified having a no-mow zone along Robinson Hill Road, and the community had, I went back the next time and there was this sign there, which was wonderful, to allow the vegetation to grow along the road. And this is Anna Dodge Road, kind of this steep ditch that goes along the road. And Bragg Road, the same thing. There's a pretty steep ditch, and we designed a stormwater project so sediment wouldn't go down and get into this brook. In terms of the lakeshore projects that were identified, they were in a number of different categories, and there were 9 lakeshore projects altogether. So a number of them were stormwater improvement projects. There were some buffer improvement projects and some projects to improve retaining walls by implementing a bioengineering design. And bioengineering just means that we're taking native materials like rocks and coconut fiber matting that holds the soil in place, and using native vegetation and sloping the bank back to kind of make a better connection between the lake and the land adjacent to the lake. So this is Treasure Island, the access road, doing some improvements. I'll talk about that later in the PowerPoint presentation, doing some additional work along the beach at Treasure Island. A buffer enhancement project at Treasure Island, and a bioengineered lakefront at someone's camp on the lake. And then another project looking at reducing runoff or sand running off into the lake at the Ohana family camp. And I understand this project's already been implemented. A bioengineered lakeshore at the Horizons Day Camp, improving the buffer along Route 244, which is involves a number of property owners and is also within the right of way. And it's a bit tricky just because there's such a short distance between the road and the lake. We were actually on Lake Maury yesterday, and the land between the road and the lake is really steep, and so all the vegetation is still there. I think maybe when it's easier to cut the vegetation down is when it's flatter along the road. So that might be something we want to look at in the future, is ways to try to increase the vegetation along the lake in those areas where it's close to the road.
Mary, may I interrupt with a question, or is that for later?
Oh, no, you can ask.
Oh, thank you. Along 244, the densely populated, close to the lake strip of road, isn't that state owned?
I think a lot of it is within the right of way. Although there may be some properties that have land that have houses on the other side of the lake, and then have the lake shore on the opposite side. But most of it, yes, I would say most of it is state owned. And then a project at the Aloha Hive Camp. And then when we went back to work on our conceptual designs, we also revisited the Treasure Island parking lot and thought it would benefit for for reestablishment of the water bars and adding an additional water bar. The parking lot is fairly close to the lake. And so it made sense to try to reduce sediment off of the parking lot to the extent feasible. We had 4 stream projects, and most of these are on agricultural lands, either to improve buffers along the property or to reduce animal crossings or livestock exclusion. So these are the 4 projects. So in this case, it was a project on Middlebrook to increase buffers along the stream, along the ag fields. This was to either create a no-mow zone or do some plantings on a project where there's active bank erosion on Middlebrook. This is a project on Bloodbrook to reduce animal crossings in the lower left corner here. And then a project on Bloodbrook to reduce animal crossings and to implement a livestock exclusion program. So we talked about our project prioritization at the last meeting a couple months ago. And so there are 5 categories, and we scored each of those categories from 0 to 3. So in looking at those 5 categories, if the project scored a 3, that was the highest value possible. So the first category is improves water quality, and we use this phosphorus reduction tool that the DEC has to figure out how many kilograms of phosphorus per year would get reduced by the project. And that received 25% of the score, or a weighting of 25%. We looked at landowner support, and that pretty much ranged from lack of interest to having a landowner agreement. And that also had a high score. And that's really important in implementing projects. If you don't have landowner support, you don't get very far. So we thought a weighting of 25% made a lot of sense. We also thought improving riparian aquatic habitat was pretty important. So we weighted that 20%. And then we looked at cost effectiveness. And that's really how much money it costs per kilogram of phosphorus that's been reduced per year. And we gave that a 20% weighting. And then the project could earn up to 3 points based on these additional benefits. So whether it improves or protects infrastructure, if it's a demonstration project, or if it's reducing flows and erosion, if it's an educational, it provides education for the community, or if it reduces flooding. So it could earn up at least earn 1 point per each benefit, up to 3 points maximum. So I have a slide here showing the highest priority projects. And we looked at that first, including landowner support. So we looked at all 5 categories. And the Lakeshore Bioengineering projects came up highest for our projects and highest priority. So they were in first and second place. And then the no-mow zone adjacent to Robinson Hill Road, that came in third place. And that's already been implemented, as I talked about. That's an important project. And then 2 of the projects on agriculture, related to agriculture, came in 4th and 5th. And they came up high because of the amount of phosphorus that could potentially be reduced and the cost effectiveness. So even though landowner interest was low, they still made it into the top 5 projects, which is pretty interesting. And then we did the same thing. We rated the projects and we took out the category landowner support. So we only used the 4 other categories. And 3 of our 5 projects, these 3 projects, all having to do with agriculture, came up the highest. They were all tied for first. So that's widen the buffers along Middlebrook, along the ag fields, livestock exclusion with buffer plantings on Bloodbrook, and livestock exclusion on lower Bloodbrook. And then the Lakeshore Bioengineering Project at the Horizons Camp came in second after that, and enhancing buffers adjacent to Route 244 came in 5th. And I wouldn't get too hung up on, which project came in first. I think, if you have landowner interest and you can get funding, I would just go ahead and move forward with the project. But certainly landowner support is really important. So I'm going to talk to you about 3 different conceptual designs. There are 10 in the report. This is an example of a stormwater improvement project at Treasure Island, and it's on the access road. So just to orient you, the beach is over here. And then there's an access road that goes along the tennis courts that goes down to like the picnic area on the island. And so the thought behind this was to narrow the existing access road. So right now it's, and I'll show you here, it's between 13 and 14 feet wide. And it's really steep. So this dashed line shows what it looks like now. So it goes out and then it just drops right down. And we can see sediment coming off this gravel road and going down over the bank. And this is really steep contours, and the lake is right below. So we thought if we could reduce the width of the access road and remove some of this material so it's not so steep and put in some native plantings, we could help reduce the amount of sediment that's going over the bank. So our conceptual designs, we provided a site plan. We provided the proposed design elements and some details. There's a preliminary cost estimate that's in the Lake Watershed Action Plan and expected permits. And I just wanted to talk about like expected permits. I think as you go from a conceptual design to a final design, sometimes the project changes slightly. There is a project review form that can be completed on the DEC website. And it's always good to go through that project review just to make sure that you're getting permits for everything that's needed before a project takes place. This is the bioengineered project at the Horizons Camp. And right now there's an existing failed concrete wall that you can see here. And this would involve putting in a new stone toe. And this provides like a drawing that shows what would happen. So you would have some natural stone at the base, and you would slope this back and put something like coconut fiber matting to hold the soil in place. And then you would vegetate using willows or other native plants and some trees if you can also, if there's room to put them in. So that's what a bioengineered design would look like. And then for the cost estimate, that had a number of components. That had erosion control that was included in the cost estimate. Basically, you'd have to go in and excavate and haul material away, imported stone. Then there's the cost of the plantings and site restoration. And then you would have to have survey and engineering and permitting costs included. So that just gives you an example of what goes into the cost estimate. And in this case, a Vermont shoreland permit would be needed, and a section 404 permit from the Army Corps of Engineers. And then our last project is on Anadodge Lane, and that also is a stormwater improvement project. So right now, there's a pretty steep, the road is fairly steep, and it goes in, down this ditch. And so the thought behind this project, you can see Matt here from Ripple Natural Resources. He helped me design the conceptual design projects. You can see him standing there in the road. So one alternative would be to put in a cross culvert, so not all this runoff would continue going down the road. The runoff from the upper part of the road would go across, and it would dissipate or be spread out on this side of the road. So this gives you an example of where the cross culvert would go in. Right now, there's an existing cross culvert here that takes a flow from above. So the water's flowing down this way, and that goes through the cross culvert, and the water spreads out in here. And then I'm talking about this section of road that's fairly steep. The road actually doesn't go like that. That's the way the parcel data is shown. And it's a bit more curved than that. It's not like this jagged edge. But anyway, one alternative, and our preferred alternative, would be to put in another cross culvert. And then there's an existing wooded flow path that's right here. And if there was a way to do some regrading to get the water to go from here into that existing wooded flow path and away from the building that's on this property, that would be the preferred way to go. And the reason why we like that alternative is it doesn't require a lot of maintenance. The other alternative is to put in these 3 check dams along the road, and they're just stone that's built up, and then the water slows down behind the stone, and it settles out. And that does require maintenance. So the stone check dams is a cheaper alternative, but would require maintenance over time. And then our next steps. So the next steps here are to move these preliminary or conceptual designs toward implementation, and possibly do some further assessment work, including more lake-wise visits and stream walkovers. And we appreciate all the help everyone's giving us along the way. The Lake Fairlee Association, all the landowners who participated in Lakewise, and the Department of Environmental Conservation for providing both funding and technical support.
Great, thanks, Mary. I guess before we move on to the sort of next steps, does anybody else, there were a few questions along the way. Does anybody else have any other questions for Mary?
I have one question, Lisa, for you or Mary. The 2 most probably effective and useful overall projects have to do with I guess the agricultural lands or whatever, or the lands along, were both those project Bloodbrook, or maybe it was Middlebrook and Bloodbrook?
Both Brooks.
Which don't have landowner support. Have you seen successes in obtaining landowner support where it originally was not available? What are the options for that, or the tax for that? Are there any state funds that might be uniquely available, especially if it's agricultural? I think one had animal crossings.
Yeah, there are several special projects designated for agricultural, like exactly for livestock exclusions, for pasture fencing, all of that kind of thing. Many different entities have reached out and tried to engage these landowners and generate some interest, and have not been successful. So it's a really frustrating situation, and kind of just have to keep trying, I think, is the answer, unfortunately, which isn't very satisfactory. I do know that some of the other watershed action plans on different lakes sort of ran into a similar kind of situation and just kind of kept picking away at it over the years, and slowly we're successful on some of the projects. So that'll have to be our approach here. Is these are not surprises. The Conservation Commission and other entities have known about these issues for a while, and just there just isn't a great deal we can do.
And I'll add to that. My name is Jennifer Byrne. I'm the district manager of the White River Conservation District, and we have an increasingly we've been increasing our capacity to do this type of outreach to agriculture. So now we actually have 6 employees at our district now. 3 or 4 are really focused on agriculture. So we'll continue to do outreach to them, and there's even more funding than ever in terms of agriculture programs. So we're very aware of all of them, and we try to puzzle piece all these pots of money together for folks. So I hope that being in this plan will be some type of signal to them that hopefully if we approach it right, it will be a kind of a request from the community. Something just to think about is it's a cost to the landowner. Even if there are programs, there's always a cost share. And so, I kind of put this out there to every community. It's the landowner or the farmer will be responsible for 10 to 20% of these costs. So, being creative of how we do maybe some public fundraising, sometimes that helps if we can figure out how to cover that cost share for the landowner.
Is there also, beyond the cost share, is there maybe in these specific instances, is there a revenue impact for them in that it's decreasing their ability to hay or raise cattle?
Yeah, it can be. And some of the programs try to account for that. I don't know that that's really the case in these particular scenarios, maybe in one of them.
I think it would be, given the shape of the fields, it'd be a pretty significant area that would be removed from production, or things like that. So that's the concern or at least that's, how they view it. The reality of, I'm just not sure.
Yeah, I think it's difficult when the fields are narrow to begin with, and that may be the concern.
Right.
Stephen, you've had your hand up for a few minutes. Did you want to?
Quick question, if you can hear me. Am I coming through?
Yep.
Yes.
You recommended paving and a culvert on Robinson Hill Road.
Yes.
Where would that culvert be in relation to, say, Camp Norway, the old Camp Norway?
It's kind of near Norway Road or Norway Lane. So it's just, yeah, you'll see it on the plans. I can pull it up, but yeah, it's just before that, right in that area.
Okay, and how far up the hill would you pave, do you think?
I think the plan calls for 550 feet or 600. It just goes to where there's a buffer again along the lake. So it's not all the way up the hill.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And we did look at the proposal that the town, they did the request for bids, and I know that there weren't bidders a few years ago, and we look at that and incorporate some of that information into this suggested activity.
I think
Thanks, Lisa.
their bid, when it went out to bid for the paving, it was a more extensive project than we're proposing. So the paving would just be along the lake where there's a really narrow buffer between the road and the lake.
I think I know what you mean. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Dawn, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, thanks. Just, I know, we talked a lot about, stormwater runoff and the agricultural runoff potentially into the tributaries. Was there any in your travels, were there any obvious signs of, potential septic problems or anything like that? I mean, people talk a lot about around the lake anecdotally about, septic concerns, septic systems, failed septic systems. And I know there's a lot of concern about inspections and things like that. But if there, I guess my thought is if there wasn't really any strong evidence pointing towards failed septic systems, do we really need to focus our energies there? And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Lisa, do you have thoughts on that? I wasn't on all the properties you were on, so.
Yeah, I mean, I guess Lakewise is a wonderful program, and I got to talk to a lot of people. I suspect I talked to the people who were, knew more about what was going on in the lake. And so I saw a lot of upgraded systems that are, people had invested quite a bit of money to improve, or talk to people who are being very careful to maintain their systems. But by no means did I talk to everybody. And so my instinct would be like, there is the wastewater workshop that hopefully Lake Fairlee will sort of help promote, that is going on in Fairlee with the Lake Maury Protective Association on July 13th. So I think encouraging people, we were told yesterday that somebody said, hey, if you can tell me why a maintained system is better than a cesspool, I might be interested in upgrading, because unfortunately they had been told that a cesspool was just as good. So I think there's like an education level that needs to happen. And unfortunately, the funding, I don't think, is in place yet. Allison is on this call. I don't know if she's aware of any sort of assistance that's available, but there hasn't been until now. So it's sort of tricky. A lot of these small camps, that maybe have been in the family forever, are owned by older people, who just aren't sort of as aware. So I don't know. We weren't exactly looking at that because it's, would be within the lake, and we were mostly sort of standing on the edge of the lake and looking back, I guess would be the way to think about it. The state is really focused on what's happening within the lake. But, that what I've sort of said as I've talked to people is, you like to swim in this lake, right? And nobody wants to swim in overflow and failing systems. And, it only leads to various outbreaks of E. coli and other unpleasant things. So I think it's always worth the education component, but we didn't directly look at that. And I didn't talk to a lot of landowners who, I didn't see evidence of failing systems. I didn't hear people saying like, oh, I never do anything with it. The folks that I spoke to were like, we have it inspected. And, the camps pump, every camp I talked to, they're getting pumped once a year and constantly making sure that they're functioning correctly. So that's was encouraging for me to hear. And most of the landowners were as well. So,
Okay.
Not 100% satisfactory answer, but that's the information that I.
No, it's just a part of the larger picture about, what's happening with the lake, right? So just wanted to make sure that we were thinking about it. If we needed to, if it's an important priority to focus on, we should be thinking about it. But it doesn't sound like there's any strong evidence pointing one way or the other right now. So
I would say education is always beneficial. And, one of the things that occurred to me is that Jay's Septic is the primary service provider in this area. And, it might be worth sort of getting the lake associations together to just provide some additional education for them and, sort of try to help, obviously it's their livelihood, but if they're informed and have maybe a handout or something, I think that would be really potentially beneficial.
The map shows a lot of dwellings upstream, up the two major tributaries, a lot of houses up there. Their failed septic systems are equally at risk for getting phosphorus into the lake. They are not necessarily in the well-to-do housing of people who live around the lake, and they're very modest housing, and some of them are even mobile homes up there that could be a source. Again, the source might not be evident unless there was a high flow event where things were flushed out of the woods into the creek. I don't know how to reach these people, but we should not forget that that's a source of phosphorus also.
Well, it's something to think about, looking at the water quality monitoring data. There is a program called Streamwise that is it was based on Lakewise, and it just is for people who live on streams and rivers and things like that. We aren't currently funded to do that work, but if we, sort of wanted to think about it in the future, we might be able to sort of say, hey, we're concerned, and do some outreach for Streamwise.
Yeah, I think it would be worth it to do more assessment work on some of the other tributaries. I mean, there are 12 tributaries, inlet streams. That's a lot to cover in a study like this. And so I think it would be a great idea to have more funding for that and for the program you're talking about, Lisa.
Right. David.
Yeah, just a quick question. The town of Fairlee implemented through an interim zoning bylaw proposal that's coming up for public hearing in July, a Lake District area on both Lake Maury and Lake Fairlee. The Lake Maury one is, of course, very strict. Although there hasn't seemed to have been much of a blowback in terms of reaction to that. But there's a less stringent one for Lake Fairlee. Now, I know West Fairlee comprises 22% of the shoreline on Lake Fairlee. I'm not conversant with how much Thetford and Fairlee hold. Is it worth pursuing, assuming that this Lake District is adopted for the town of Fairlee? Is it worth pursuing a similar Lake District from West Fairlee and Thetford to make it a complete district rather than a partial one?
I think certainly, if that's politically, I mean, the more cohesive a plan you have around the lake, the better.
Well, the reason I asked, Lisa, is, Thetford, relatively speaking, I think would, through education and outreach and so forth, would in all likelihood, be positive towards that sort of thing. West Fairlee, by contrast, has no zoning to speak of. And there's always a cohort that sees that as the first step of a slippery slope, if you will. But my point being that with the town of Fairlee doing what they're doing, I think that's great. But if it isn't adopted by all three towns bordering Lake Fairlee, I question its effectiveness. So, we could certainly do some outreach to both West Fairlee and Thetford, and show them what the town of Fairlee has done, and try to get some kind of measure of reaction to that and whether they're friendly towards it. So I was just curious about whether you'd heard anything or had any feelings about that.
I think we have some members from select boards in those two towns. I don't know if anyone wants to comment, if there's been any discussion in Thetford or West Fairlee.
West Fairlee is just that we have our new town plan is waiting to be adopted, and there's some discussion of some sort of very basic zoning, but that's going to be a while coming. I do want to point out that much of what West Fairlee has on the lakefront is Treasure Island. We own, yeah, I mean, that is located in the town of West Fairlee. Much of it has nothing on it. It's Aloha, you know, so that if you look at the stretch there, and those are good, responsible landowners there.
Very, yes.
I also want to point out that in addition to the wetlands up Middlebrook Road, there is now, this past year, we doubled the amount of conserved lands that are directly connected to that watershed. So there's now over 800 acres in Upper Valley Land Trust and Vermont's first Healthy Forest Reserve. So,
Well done.
you know, there's private action going on, and there are some good, responsible landowners in that 22%.
Fantastic, thanks. And I also just want to point out, back to the septic issue, Allison did say that there's public funding to replace failing septic systems, but they're only for primary residents. And so if it's a secondary resident, that changes it, and there's income caps. But that may be something to think about if we did a little bit more outreach on the streams, because I think those are more primary homes. That may be a resource. Okay, were there any other questions?
Lisa, it's Catherine. I'm not sure I know how to ask this question or make this comment without sounding very whiny, but I guess I'm willing to do that. You know, it seems to me, as we kayak around the lake and know it quite well, you know, there are a whole bunch of landowners that are still having their lawns mowed pretty much mostly right to the edge of the lake. And something I'm wondering is how, I mean, I know we each have a right to our own property and stuff like that, but is there a way to kind of have a generic ask of us all? Like, you know, would you consider simply, you know, not mowing the 10 feet closest to the lake minus the 6-foot path? I mean, something super concrete that people might be able to embrace, and that we, you know, encourage a change of mowing.
So
And
thank you for those comments. I would
pardon.
be respectful of everybody's time. It is 11 o'clock, so I had only said an hour, I think. So if anybody needs to leave, I understand, but I would love to keep this discussion, and I do want to respond to Catherine. So thank you, everybody, and we'll just keep, you know, we've sort of talked a little bit more, so there's just a little more I want to go through, but give you that opportunity. So Catherine, I think that is a great idea. You know, we tried to reach people through Lakewise. Obviously, continuing that program is wonderful, and Allison she's available and is funded to continue doing the Lakewise assessments if I'm not. So there is that resource, and I think from the Lake Fairlee Association, I think that would be a wonderful campaign, you know, that they just sort of launched in their newsletters and in their annual meetings, and just sort of continue sort of a more general education. I don't know, you know, one interesting thing that we saw on Lake Maury is that a lot of homeowners had to put up fencing to keep the Canadian geese off their land. I don't know, I haven't really seen that issue as much on Lake Fairlee, but Canadian geese love closely mowed land right down to the water, and they poop a lot, and it's disgusting, and if you like to walk barefoot, you can't. So, you know, there's components like that, you know, that you could just sort of appeal to people. I know there was interest a few years ago in doing, I think it was a Blue for Blue was maybe the byline of planting blueberries for clean water was the concept. And they sort of secured maybe wholesale pricing on a bunch of blueberry bushes and then tried to get landowners to plant them along the water. And somehow the program sort of didn't, it was interrupted maybe by the pandemic or something like that. But, you know, that sort of thing could, you know, work with a supplier and really try to launch getting some plantings. You know, it is private property. People have varying amounts of love for mowed grass, but there's a lot of neat resources sort of showing what it can look like with, say, a pollinator garden. And, you know, the idea too of getting the Lakewise signs up so that people can see like, oh, it's actually quite attractive. You know, if you're one of, you know, some people really like natural, some people prefer a more manicured look. Both are effective options.
We have an LFA meeting tomorrow night. I think maybe I'll bring this up as maybe something we could talk about and just see if we can get more people on, you know, the what are you willing to do? Are you willing to? So what is the ideal buffer, 15 feet? Or, you know, if we were to,
I mean, the wider the better, let's put it that way. So yeah.
If we want to be concrete for people to work towards something, what it's like 15 feet, right?
Yeah, I mean, that would be ideal, you know, as a place to work. So
Thank
so
you.
I have a little note. So unfortunately, Jennifer and I share a Zoom account and she has another meeting that's getting started. So I need to wrap this up so that she can do that. I guess we didn't coordinate quite as well as I thought we had. So essentially, all I wanted to do was say that I will be putting together a press release to announce this report, that it's available. I would love to get a quote from anybody who feels like this was a useful process. And I will be contacting some folks, but if you want to shoot me an email afterwards and say, hey, you know, I'm happy to provide something, we could work something like that out. And then I will be doing some outreach to the priority projects where we had, and I've talked to most of the landowner. I mean, I've talked to all the landowners, so, you know, they know that their projects were selected, and then we'll sort of talk about finding funding moving forward and what that would look like, and some of the programs that are coming up. And then most importantly, I just want to say thank you to everybody. It was really wonderful to have such great participation and assistance moving forward with this project. Mary Nealon was wonderful to work with, and I'm really excited with that we've got this report and ready to move forward and keep working on projects to help Lake Fairlee. So
thank you, Mary, and thank you, Lisa. Well presented. Thank you.
Super. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Jennifer, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, just before people jump, I put a link in the chat to our website, whiterivernrcd.org. We have a survey that's open right now to the public to inform natural resource priorities in your community and tell the state and the federal government how we want to see money directed. So if you have a moment, it's really just one page. It probably takes maybe 15-20 minutes. We'd appreciate you taking it, sharing it. And also, I'm sure, you know, reach out to Lisa or but I know I saw at the very beginning in the chat that your annual meeting is taking place Saturday, July 22nd. So if we maybe want to have more of a discussion, answer the questions that we didn't get to today, or discuss some things, we'd be happy to figure out how we can be there for that discussion. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Bye now.